It's time to make it, just give it a try. 'Cause you can make it like the old fat guy.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of You Can Make It. I'm David Farrell. Today I'm going to make one of the most versatile side dishes in the world, cornbread. Cornbread can be used as a side dish with ribs, pork roast, chili, anything you like that's rich because it has a really strong texture that stands up to rich, greasy foods. It can even be crumbled up and put in dressings or buttered and drizzled with honey and used for a dessert. I've had it my whole life. My mom used to call it Johnny cake, and I'm going to show you how I make it. To make cornbread, you start off with cornmeal. Now, cornmeal could just be used in it, but I find that if you soak the cornmeal in some milk first, you get a better texture in your cornbread. So I'm going to add this milk to the cornmeal and just give it a stir. That's 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of cornmeal and 300 milliliters or 1 1/4 cups of milk. Now, I'm just going to let it soak for between 20 minutes and 3 hours. You have to let it soak for at least 20 minutes to give the good texture to the cornmeal, and if you let it sit for too much longer than 3 hours, you run the risk of the milk starting to curdle. So we're just going to let this sit and then come back and make the rest of the recipe. The cornmeal and milk has sat for, in this case, about half an hour. Like I say, it's got to sit at least for 20 minutes. Now I want to add the rest of my liquid ingredients from the recipe to that mixture. And what I have here is 50 milliliters or 1/4 of a cup of vegetable oil and an egg. Now we just want to break that egg up. I just mix it up with the cornmeal and just get her into, don't worry about getting a smooth mixture, you just want to get it generally mixed in. Now in a second bowl, you want to mix together the dry ingredients. And I have 250 milliliters or 1 cup of all-purpose flour. And I have, and I forget the amount here, I have 75 milliliters or 1/3 of a cup of sugar and 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. That's 1 milliliter of salt. So they get mixed together in the dry ingredients. Now, we want to mix the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients, and you don't have to worry about getting a real smooth mix. A few lumps are fine. You just don't want to overmix it, because if you overmix it, it'll get bread-like instead of the nice cake texture you expect from cornbread. So we'll just mix those two together. Like I say, the main thing is to get all the ingredients moistened as opposed to trying to make a smooth batter. Make sure you scrape up all the dry ingredients off the bottom. Now that you've got them all mixed together, I have here an 8-inch square cake pan, and I've just sprayed it with some baking spray so it'll lift out easily. And you'll see there's lumps in the batter as I pour it in there, no problem at all. This is now going to go into a 400-degree Fahrenheit oven for 30 minutes. The cornbread has been in the oven for 30 minutes, but you don't just want to take it out. You want to take a toothpick and put it in the center of it and make sure it comes out clean. That lets you know your cornbread is totally cooked. Once it's cooked, let it rest and cool for at least 5 minutes or longer to right cool if you want to, and it's ready to serve. I like to eat it when it's just a touch warm, just like this one is. So we'll just cut across and take a square out. If that doesn't look pretty, I don't know what does. And we'll just slice through it. And who says you've got to be healthy? I think you need just a bit of butter on it. Let that melt in. And it just, you can smell it right away. The cornbread has a flavor and a smell. It's just so good. So let's give a taste of our cornbread. It has a sort of cake-like texture, but the cornmeal gives it a bite. There's a touch of sweet, good, nice, rich corn flavor. This is an excellent cornbread, and you can make it.
In this recipe, David made cornbread. The ingredients are 175 milliliters of cornmeal, 300 milliliters of milk, 250 milliliters of all-purpose flour, 8 milliliters of baking powder, 3 milliliters of salt, 75 milliliters of sugar, 1 egg, and 50 milliliters of oil. For the complete recipe, visit David's blog at oldfatguy.ca. And, as always, you can make it. It's time to make it. Just give it a try. 'Cause you can make it like the old fat guy.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of You Can Make It with David Farrell. That's me. When I was growing up, we'd have chili con carne, and it was just basically hamburger mixed with tomato sauce, can of beans, and a bunch of chili powder thrown in it. Well, you can do a lot better. We're going to change it up, and today we're going to make pork chili. This is going to be chili made with chopped pork meat instead of ground meat, and it's going to be using a different herb blend and fewer beans. And it's a really different variety on chili, and I think you'll really enjoy it. It's also pretty easy to make. I started off by heating up a electric fry pan to medium high. You can also do it in a Dutch oven on the stove at medium high. You're just going to add 2 tablespoons of oil to the heated pan, and I've got 1.5 kilograms or 3 pounds of pork. You can use pork loin, sirloin, butt roast, any kind of boneless pork you like, and just cut it up between 1/4 and 1/2 inch pieces and then throw it in the pan. If you don't have a really big pan, I suggest that you try and do it in little batches because the pork will give off a lot of water and stop it from browning. Now it's going to take 5, maybe 6 minutes for this pork to brown up. Just keep moving it around in the hot pan until it gets a bit of golden brown on it. Unlike beef, it won't get a dark brown. It'll just get a nice light golden color. So I'll just let this sit in the pan and start to brown. Now that this has been cooking for 5 or 6 minutes, you can see it's got just a light golden brown color on it. It's not really dark brown. You're not trying to sear it or scorch it. You just want a little golden color. And we're ready to add some more ingredients. We're going to start with 3 stalks of celery I've cut up to 1/4 inch, and a medium onion I've cut up to 1/4 inch dice, and we're going to add that to the pork. We don't want to really cook the onions and the celery. We want to do what they call sweating them. We just want to stir them around until they start to give off a little bit of liquid. It just makes them a little less sharp in the final chili. This will just take 35-40 seconds, and you just want to get some moisture out of them. You'll note that the pork still gets a bit more color as you're stirring. That's why you leave it in while you're doing the onions and the celery. You can see that a little bit of liquid's coming out of the onions and the peppers. That's the sweating completed, so we're going to add the rest of the ingredients for our chili, with the exception of some beans we'll add later. We're going to start off with 2 796 milliliter cans of diced tomatoes, including the liquid. Just add those. And then we're going to add the 14 ounces of tomato sauce canned tomato sauce. You can use fresh if you've made some. And you can always splash it on the counter. My wife always appreciates that. And we have half a cup of soy sauce. We're also going to add some spices. I have 2 tablespoons of chili powder, 25 milliliters of chili powder, or 2 tablespoons. I have 2 milliliters or a half teaspoon of ground chilies, quarter teaspoon if you like it mild. I like it mild, so I've gone a quarter teaspoon. I have 2 teaspoons of beef base. That's the stuff you make beef bouillon out of. You can use that or the cubes, 2 cubes if you use the cubes. I have 1 teaspoon of dried rosemary and a half teaspoon of dried thyme. So that would be 5 milliliters of dried rosemary or 3 milliliters of dried thyme. And they're going to go into the mixture. Then we'll just stir it all up to get a good mix on it. I've had people say, what are you doing putting soy sauce in a chili? It gives a really more meatier taste and gives it a nicer color, I think, and a better feel on the tongue. It won't taste like soy sauce. Once you've got it mixed up, we're just going to put a lid on it and lower the heat to a simmer. We're going to let it simmer for 1 hour covered. So I'll just turn the heat down and we'll come back to it in an hour. The chili's been simmering for an hour with the lid on, and I've stirred it a couple of times just to make sure it doesn't stick. It rarely does. Now I'm going to add the beans. The reason that you're going to add the beans now instead of at the beginning is so they don't cook too soft. So we'll just take the lid off and add, I have here a 586 milliliter can of kidney beans. You can use pinto beans or any canned beans you like. These red kidney beans have been rinsed under water because the liquid in the can of beans has a lot of salt in them and I don't want to oversalt my chili. So I've rinsed them off, drained them, and I'm just going to add it to the chili. You'll notice that it's not a lot of beans. I find I like some creaminess in my chili, but I don't want it to be all beans. I like a lot of meat. So now that I've got the beans in the chili, we're going to let it continue to simmer for 20 minutes, and it's very important that it's uncovered for that 20 minutes because we want some of it to boil up, tighten the sauce so it's a bit thicker, and make the chili a little bit more substantial. So I'm just going to let this simmer for 20 minutes now, and then we'll come back and we'll be able to have a bowl of pork chili. This is the part of the show where I suspect you might be a little jealous of me because I get to taste what I cooked. And pork chili is definitely something that I really enjoy tasting. We'll just take a nice big spoonful of it here. The pork is incredibly tender. The beans are nice and creamy, but still have some texture. Just the slightest little bite of heat. But because I used the rosemary and the thyme, it has a herb profile you normally don't get in chili that really goes well with the pork. This is a super pork chili, and you can make it.
In this recipe, David prepared pork chili. The ingredients used are 1.2 kilograms of pork, diced, 25 milliliters of oil, 375 milliliters of diced onion, 150 milliliters of celery, diced, 398 milliliters of tomato sauce, 1,592 milliliters of canned diced tomatoes with the juices, 25 milliliters of chili powder, 2 milliliters of dried chili flakes, 3 milliliters of dried thyme, 5 milliliters of dried rosemary, 125 milliliters of soy sauce, 2 beef bouillon cubes, and 540 milliliters of canned beans. For the complete recipe, visit David's blog at oldfatguy.ca. And remember, you can make it.
It's time to make it, just give it a try. 'Cause you can make it like the old fat guy.
I really appreciate you coming to this episode of You Can Make It. Today we're going to make one of my favorite things in the world, which is an apple crisp. I've always loved apple crisp. I like the sweet tart apples and the crispy crunchy top on it. But today I'm going to throw a wrinkle at you. I'm going to use molasses to sweeten the apples instead of sugar or brown sugar. It gives it a really nice taste that reminds me of Halloween and ginger snap cookies, and it's just a different dessert to give your friends, and it's also very easy to make. We're going to start by making the crisp mixture that goes over the top of the apple crisp. I have my stand mixer out with the paddle attachment on it, and I have 1/3 cup or 75 milliliters of butter or margarine. I have 1/2 cup or 125 milliliters of brown sugar. And we're going to start by creaming those two together. We'll just lower the stand mixer down and start it on slow. And slowly pick up the speed. When the two are all combined into a mixture, you can see that it's just formed a nice mixture. We're going to add to it 175 milliliters or 3/4 of a cup of all-purpose flour. And now you really want to go slow for this next little bit or the flour will puff up. Slowly speed it up as it starts to blend in. And you want to mix it until it's crumbly. You want a crumbly, mealy mixture to put over the top of your apples. And there we go. So I'll just show this to you. You can see that we have a nice crumbly, mealy mixture. So I'm just going to get my stand mixer out of the way. I can make more noise if I try. And bring in 5 apples that I have peeled, cored, and sliced that we'll be using for our apple crisp. And I'm just going to mix some sweetener and some spices into those apples. We're going to start by taking 1/3 of a cup or 75 milliliters of molasses. And we're just going to drizzle it over the apples. Great thing about molasses is it does stick to everything, but it is so tasty. Now that we've got the molasses on the apples, we need to add some seasonings. And we're just going with a very basic apple seasoning, a teaspoon or 5 milliliters of cinnamon, and 1 milliliter or 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And we'll just add those to the apples and mix them around. You just got to get it coating all the apples. So now we've got the apples covered with the seasonings and the molasses. We want to put our crisp mixture on the top. Just spread it over it and press it out so that it's covering all of the apples and you've got a reasonably smooth surface. If you've got any apples like that that show through, just push them under. Now this is going to go into a 350-degree oven for 30 minutes and it'll be just bubbling and beautiful. The molasses apple crisp has been in the oven for 30 minutes, and you want to take it out and let it cool down for at least 5 minutes. 10 or 15 is better. It's even good cold though, so don't worry about it if you want to make it ahead for a meal. Of course, now that we've made it, we've got to try it. So we'll just take a nice little piece of it out here and put it in a bowl. And you can't have a good crisp without ice cream. So we'll just put a little bowl of ice cream on top of that. Get out a spoon and try our molasses apple crisp. The crisp is almost fudge-like. The apples are cooked soft but still have a good bite. And the molasses gives it a really rich, deep sweetness that you just can't get with sugar. I think you'd really like this, and the best part is you can make it.
In this recipe, David prepared molasses apple crisp. The ingredients used were 75 milliliters of butter, 125 milliliters of brown sugar, 175 milliliters of sifted flour, 75 milliliters of fancy molasses, 5 milliliters of cinnamon, 1 milliliter of salt, and 5 apples, peeled, cored, and sliced. For the complete recipe, visit David's blog at oldfatguy.ca. As David says, you can make it.